The afternoon sun, warm and golden for early autumn, spills across the worn oak floorboards of my living room. It illuminates the million tiny dust motes dancing in the air, each a silent, whirling star in its own brief galaxy. From my chair, the one with the floral pattern faded from decades of use, I have a perfect view of my garden. The late-season roses are still clinging to their color, their deep crimson a defiant splash against the encroaching gold and brown of the maples. The hydrangeas have softened to a dusty mauve, heavy-headed and dreaming of cooler weather. Everything is in its place, ordered and calm. I have always found a deep, abiding solace in the logic of a garden. You plant, you water, you prune, you wait. The results are honest. They do not lie. On the polished cherrywood table beside me, next to a half-finished cup of chamomile tea, sits a photograph of my late husband, Richard. It's in a heavy silver frame, the one his colleagues from the firm gave him upon his retirement. In the picture, he is younger, his hair still dark, his smile confident and easy. It's the smile that charmed the whole of Maple Creek for nearly 50 years. But if you were to stand here right beside my chair, you would notice a small detail. The frame is not facing forward. It's turned, just slightly, so that his silver-etched gaze is directed not at me or at the room, but at the wall. It is a small, quiet act of dismissal, one that no visitor would ever question. It is perhaps the most honest thing in this house. People in Maple Creek always said Richard and I had the perfect life. The perfect house on the perfect tree-lined street, the perfect marriage that endured through all the seasons of life. When he passed last year, they came in a steady, somber stream. They brought foil-wrapped casseroles heavy with cheese and sympathy, their faces etched with practiced sorrow. They'd clasp my hand, their skin dry and papery, and whisper condolences. "He was such a good man, Lily. You were so devoted. You must be heartbroken." At the funeral, I stood by the polished casket, a pillar of quiet dignity. That's what they called me. "She's so strong," I heard Helen Parrish whisper to her daughter behind a gloved hand. Strong, because my eyes were dry, because my hands clasped in front of me did not tremble. They mistook the calm of a long-awaited shore for the resilience of a ship still weathering the storm. They were wrong. Every single one of them was wrong. I wasn't crying, not for the man they were lowering into the Vermont earth. I have no tears left for him. The tears I might have shed were cried long ago, in silence, into my pillow, where the sound would be swallowed by the night. The emptiness I felt wasn't grief. It was space, the hollowing out of a place that had been occupied by a cold, heavy presence for so long. For 45 years, I had lived as a ghost in my own home, a phantom moving through rooms that were mine, but never truly my own. I smiled at the right times, hosted the annual Christmas party with the perfect grace, and wore the mask of the contented wife so well that I sometimes forgot it was a mask at all. But beneath it, I was a collection of echoes, of words left unsaid, of screams swallowed whole. So no, I did not weep for Richard. If I cried now, it would be for the girl I was when I first met him, the one with eyes full of naive trust and a heart that believed in fairy tale endings. I would cry for the woman she could have become, the one who was stolen from me not in a single violent act, but slowly, piece by piece, over thousands of seemingly ordinary days. I would cry for the woman I was never allowed to be. But I don't. Crying is for the past. My real life, you see, began the day his ended. It began with a secret. It was not a loud, explosive secret that demands to be told. It was a quiet thing, planted in the dark, fertile soil of betrayal. For years, I tended to it with the same patience I give my garden. I watered it with my silent observations, nurtured it with the truths I collected like fallen leaves, and pruned away the lies that threatened to choke it. I protected it from the harsh sun of exposure and the killing frost of despair. I waited for the right season, for the precise moment when it would be ready to bloom, not in a showy, garish display, but in a quiet, inevitable unfurling, revealing a truth more devastating than any shouted accusation. My neighbors see me now, an old woman pottering among her flowers, and they see a widow finding peace in nature. They see a life winding down to its gentle, predictable conclusion. They see Lily, Richard's quiet, devoted Lily, They have no idea that they are looking at a gardener who has cultivated a harvest of vengeance, a crop that has been decades in the making. They don't know that every weed I pull is a memory of a carefully constructed lie. Every rose I prune a small, sharp victory. The story they all know is a fiction Richard wrote, and I, his silent co-author, allowed it to be published. But the true story, the one that matters, is mine. It is a story of a Vermont fairy tale that was, in reality, a meticulously designed prison. It is a story of a love so profound it became the weapon of my own destruction, and of a betrayal so absolute it became the seed of my salvation. They think it ended with a funeral. But that is where it truly begins. The silver frame of the photograph is cool beneath my fingertips. I don't turn it around. I don't need to. The image is seared into my memory, a perfect fossil of a moment that never truly was. Richard's smile. Easy, confident, a little bit crooked on the left side. It was the first thing I ever noticed about him. That smile could have charmed the birds from the maple trees, and for a time, it charmed me more than anyone. It's a cruel trick of the memory, how it can hold such a perfect sunlit image even when you know it's built on a sinkhole. My mind drifts, pulling away from the quiet, sun-dusted room, back through the years, to a day so bright with promise, it almost hurt to look at. It was autumn, the kind of breathtaking, crisp Vermont autumn that makes you believe in magic. The air was sharp with the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves, and the mountains that ringed our valley were ablaze in impossible shades of crimson and gold. That was our wedding day. I remember the lace on my dress, how it felt against my skin, and the weight of the small pearl necklace my mother had given me. But mostly, I remember Richard's eyes as I walked towards him. In that moment, under a canopy of fiery maple leaves, his eyes held the entire world, a world he was laying at my feet. He looked at me as though I were a miracle. And I, a girl who had never asked for much more than a quiet, happy life, believed him. Richard was everything a young woman was taught to want. He was handsome, with a strong jaw and that devastating smile. But it was more than that. He had an ambition that hummed just beneath his calm exterior. He was a junior associate at the most respected law firm in Maple Creek, and everyone knew he was destined for great things. He was the kind of man who commanded respect without ever raising his voice, who could navigate a room with an effortless grace that left people feeling seen and important. He made me feel like the center of his universe. He'd listen, truly listen, when I talked about my work at the local library, his gaze so focused it made me feel like the most interesting woman on earth. He was my world. And at his side, always, was Marcus. If Richard was the steady, solid oak, Marcus was the lively, unpredictable river that flowed beside it. He was Richard's best man, his shadow, his other half since they were boys. At our wedding reception, he gave a speech that had everyone roaring with laughter one moment and wiping away a tear the next. He spoke of their childhood adventures, of the unshakable loyalty that bound them. And then he turned to me. "Lily," he'd said, raising his glass, his own smile nearly as charming as Richard's. "You've made my best friend the happiest man I've ever known. For that, you're not just gaining a husband, you're gaining a brother. Welcome to the family." And I believed him. I welcomed it. In those early days, we were inseparable, the three of us. We bought our first home that following spring, a charming white colonial with black shutters on a street lined with towering elm trees. It was a little run down, but it was ours. I can still feel the ache in my muscles from painting the living room a soft, buttery yellow, the scent of sawdust in the air as Richard and Marcus replaced the creaking porch steps. They worked together with an easy, unspoken rhythm, a symphony of hammers and saws, punctuated by laughter and the hiss of opened beer bottles. I'd bring them lemonade in tall, sweating glasses, and we'd sit on those new steps, the evening light filtering through the trees, planning the future, our future. Marcus was a constant, comfortable presence. He helped Richard build shelves for my books, his large, capable hands measuring and cutting the wood with precision. He taught me how to plant a garden that could survive a Vermont winter. He'd drop by for dinner unannounced, pulling up a chair as if it were his own, and the evening would instantly feel brighter, livelier. He was funny and self-deprecating, and he adored Richard. He looked at him with a kind of hero worship that seemed to solidify Richard's own best qualities. To me, their friendship was a beautiful thing, a testament to Richard's character. I saw it as a source of strength, another pillar supporting the perfect life we were building. I trusted them, both of them, implicitly. The foundation of my life was built on that trust. It felt as solid and ancient as the green mountains that cradled our town. Our life fell into a happy rhythm. We hosted barbecues in our backyard, the air thick with the smell of charcoal and freshly cut grass. Our friends, a collection of young couples just like us, would gather on our lawn, their children chasing fireflies as the sun went down. Richard would be at the grill, a king in his element, while Marcus refilled drinks and told stories that made everyone feel like they were part of something special. I would move between them all, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. I was Mrs. Lily Anderson, wife of the town's most promising young lawyer, mistress of the charming White House, living a life painted in the warm, vibrant colors of a fairy tale. I remember one evening in particular. It was late summer. The heat of the day had finally broken, leaving behind a soft, warm breeze. The three of us were sitting on the porch swing, which Marcus had hung just the week before. Richard was in the middle, his arms around both of us. We swayed gently, the only sounds the rhythmic creak of the chains and the chirping of crickets in the growing dark. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. The silence was full of a shared contentment, a deep, unspoken understanding. I leaned my head on Richard's shoulder, breathing in the scent of his skin, and looked past him at Marcus, who caught my eye and gave me a small conspiratorial wink, as if to say, "Can you believe how lucky we are?" In that perfect, silent moment, I felt a profound sense of peace. I was safe. I was loved. This was forever. That perfect, silent moment on the porch swing was the apex. It was the highest, brightest point of our shared life, and I returned to it in my mind more often than I should, picking at it like a loose thread on a sweater. I examine it from every angle, searching for the flaw, the crack that I must have missed. But there was nothing. It was flawless, and perhaps that was the flaw itself. Perfection is a lie, and the most beautiful lies are the ones that demand the steepest price. That golden summer bled into a spectacular autumn, the one we had been married in just a year prior. But as the season wore on, the crisp, bright days gave way to a brooding chill. The sky turned a bruised purple gray, and the wind developed a mean-spirited howl as it tore the last of the fiery leaves from the trees. The storms that rolled down from the mountains were no longer brief afternoon affairs. They were long, violent sieges that rattled the windows of our little house and made the lights flicker and die. It was on a night just like that when the first thread of my perfect life was pulled. Richard came home late from the office, his face tight with a stress I hadn't seen before.
He barely touched the dinner I'd kept warm for him. "I have to go to Boston," he said, pushing roast chicken around his plate. "A senior partner is sick. There's a deposition first thing in the morning that can't be moved." It was strange. He'd never been called away so suddenly. There was a frantic edge to his packing, a clipped, dismissive tone to his voice when I asked if I could help. "I've got it, Lily. Just stay out of the way, will you? I need to focus." He kissed me goodbye at the door, but it was a quick, dry peck on the cheek, his mind already miles down the road. I stood at the window and watched the red taillights of his car disappear into the driving rain, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. The house, our cozy sanctuary, suddenly felt vast and empty. The wail of the wind outside sounded like a lonely, mournful thing. I tried to lose myself in a book, the words blurring on the page as the storm raged. The house groaned and settled around me. A branch scraped against the siding with the sound of fingernails on a chalkboard. Then, just as a particularly violent clap of thunder shook the floorboards, the lights flickered twice and died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. My heart leaped into my throat. I was fumbling in a kitchen drawer for candles when the headlights washed across the windows, sweeping through the dark room. For a wild, hopeful second, I thought it was Richard, that he'd changed his mind and come back. But the engine sound was wrong, deeper, louder. It was Marcus's truck. A moment later, a heavy fist pounded on the front door. I opened it to find him standing on the porch, rain dripping from his hair and the collar of his thick wool coat. He was holding a heavy-duty flashlight, its beam cutting a sharp cone through the darkness. "Lily, you okay in here?" he shouted over the wind. "Saw the lights go out." Richard called me from the road, said the power was acting up earlier, and asked if I'd swing by if it went out. He was worried about you being here alone. Relief washed over me, so potent it left me weak. Of course. Richard, even stressed and rushing to Boston, was still thinking of me. He had sent Marcus. He had sent my friend, my brother, to make sure I was safe. "Oh, Marcus, thank God," I said, stepping back to let him in. "It just went out a minute ago." He stepped inside, bringing the scent of rain and cold air with him, and something else, something sharp and sweet that I recognized from our summer barbecues. Whiskey. He wasn't staggering, not slurring his words, but he had a certain flush to his cheeks and a brightness in his eyes that spoke of a few drinks to ward off the storm's chill. "Probably just a fuse," he said, his voice booming in the enclosed space. "The box is in the cellar, right? Let's go slay the dragon." His cheerfulness was a balm. I held a candle while he stomped down the rickety cellar stairs, his flashlight beam dancing over the stone walls. He was right, a fuse had blown. With a practiced twist of his wrist, he replaced it, and the house hummed back to life. The lights flickered on, warm and yellow, pushing back the oppressive darkness. "There we go," he said, climbing the stairs and brushing the dust from his hands. "Good as new." "You're a lifesaver," I said, my voice full of genuine gratitude. I went to the kitchen to make him a cup of coffee to thank him, to warm him up before he went back out into the storm. It was the polite thing to do, the normal thing. He followed me, leaning against the doorframe, watching me as I moved about the kitchen. The atmosphere began to shift, slowly at first, an almost imperceptible change in pressure. "Richard's a lucky man," he said, his voice a little lower than before. I smiled, scooping coffee grounds into the filter. "I'm the lucky one." "No, I mean it," he said, and he pushed off the doorframe, taking a step into the room. "He has all this. This perfect house, a perfect wife." He was closer now, close enough that I could smell the whiskey more strongly. I gave a nervous little laugh, busying myself with the coffee pot, using the task as a shield. "Well, I don't know about perfect." "I do," he said. His voice was right behind me now. I felt the warmth of his body before he ever touched me. "I see it. I've always seen it." A prickle of alarm, cold and sharp, went down my spine. This wasn't Marcus. This wasn't the funny, brotherly friend. This was someone else wearing his face. I turned, forcing a bright, brittle smile. "Well, the coffee's almost ready. I'm sure you want to get home before the storm gets worse." He didn't move. He just looked at me. His eyes, usually so full of laughter, were now dark and fixed. He was looking at me in a way no one ever had, a way that made me feel like an object, a thing to be assessed. He reached out and touched a stray piece of my hair, his fingers calloused and rough against my cheek. I flinched, pulling back. "Don't," I said, my voice barely a whisper. And that's when the world stopped making sense. The man who was my friend, my family, smiled. But it was not his smile. It was a predator's smile. The thunder cracked outside, a deafening, violent sound, and in that moment, he closed the distance between us. He backed me against the kitchen counter, the hard edge of the laminate digging into my spine. My polite refusals, my pleas, they were nothing. They were gnats in a hurricane. The world dissolved into a blur of terror and confusion. My mind simply refused to process it. This couldn't be happening. Not here, in my yellow kitchen. Not with Marcus, who had helped me hang the curtains in this very room. My brain kept replaying his words from my wedding day. "Welcome to the family." The sound of the rain drumming against the window was a frantic, panicked heartbeat. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, freezing his face in a grotesque mask of exertion, and I saw that his eyes were empty. There was nothing behind them. Nothing I recognized. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The sound was trapped in my throat, a solid ball of ice. All I could think over and over, a desperate, frantic prayer was, "Richard will be home any second. Richard will make this stop. Richard will save me." When it was over, the silence was more profound than the storm had been. There was only the sound of the dripping rain and the hum of the refrigerator. He stood up, adjusted his coat,
and looked down at me on the floor of my own kitchen. He didn't look sorry. He didn't look angry. He looked satisfied. "See you around, Lily," he said, as if he'd just finished fixing a leaky faucet. Then he walked out, closing the front door softly behind him, leaving me alone in the ruins. The warm yellow light of my kitchen felt obscene. My sanctuary had been violated, my reality shattered, and the only hope I had left in the entire world was the thought of my husband, my Richard, driving home to save me. I don't know how long I lay on the cold linoleum. Time had fractured, splintering into meaningless shards. The hum of the refrigerator, a sound that had always been a comforting, domestic murmur, was now a deafening, indifferent drone. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind the gentle, dripping sound of water running from the eaves. Each drop landed with the finality of a closing door. My body was a geography of aches and bruises I didn't dare to map. But the cold that seeped into my bones from the floor was nothing compared to the ice that had formed in the hollow of my chest. Eventually, some primal instinct forced me to move. I moved like an old woman, each limb heavy and disconnected from my will. I was a puppet whose strings had been cut. I pulled myself up using the counter, the same counter he had pinned me against, and my reflection in the dark kitchen window was a stranger's, a wild-eyed, hollow-cheeked ghost. I made my way upstairs, my hand trailing on the banister for support, each step a monumental effort. The bathroom was a sterile, brightly lit chamber of horrors. Every familiar object was now alien. The pink and white checkered shower curtain my mother had sewn for me, the bar of lavender soap sitting in its dish, the neatly folded towels. They were all artifacts from another life, a life that had ended just a few hours ago. I stood under the spray of the shower, the water as hot as I could stand it, and scrubbed my skin until it was raw. I was trying to wash him off me, to erase the feeling of his hands, the scent of his whiskey-laced breath. But it was a futile act. The violation wasn't on my skin. It was inside me, a poison that had already reached my soul. I looked at my own face in the steamed-up mirror, and I saw nothing. The light in my eyes had gone out. I did not sleep. I sat in the armchair in our bedroom, wrapped in a thick blanket, and watched the night bleed into a pale, gray dawn. I replayed the sequence of events over and over, my mind a broken projector stuck on a loop. Marcus's arrival, his smile, the shift in his eyes. The feeling of being trapped. But through the horror, one thought persisted, a single flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness. Richard will be home soon. Richard would fix this. Richard would know what to do. He would rage. He would seek justice. He would wrap me in his arms and make the world right again. He was my husband, my protector. My hope in him was the only thing keeping the shattered pieces of myself from dissolving completely. The morning arrived with a cruel, indifferent beauty. The sky was washed clean, a brilliant, cloudless blue. Birds sang in the wet trees. The world outside my window was utterly, infuriatingly normal. And then I heard it, the sound of his tires on the gravel driveway. The key scraped in the lock. The front door opened and closed. "Lily?" he called out. His voice was tired. I couldn't answer. I could only stand, my limbs trembling, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The moment of salvation. He came up the stairs and stopped in the bedroom doorway. He looked rumpled from the long drive, his tie loosened, a day's stubble shadowing his jaw. He saw me standing there, saw the state I was in, and a flicker of something crossed his face. It wasn't concern. It was closer to annoyance. "What is it?" he asked, dropping his briefcase on the floor. "You look like you've seen a ghost." My own voice was a stranger's, a dry, cracked whisper. I stumbled through the story, the words broken and nonsensical. "Marcus, he came over. The power. I couldn't form a coherent sentence. I was choking on the horror of it. I gestured uselessly around me, as if the air itself held the evidence of the crime. He listened. He just stood there, his face a mask of unreadable stillness, and he listened. He didn't rush to comfort me. He didn't ask if I was hurt. His arms remained at his sides. The silence stretched after my last broken word. a vast, empty canyon between us. I waited for the explosion, for the righteous fury of a husband whose wife had been violated by his best friend, but it never came. After a silence that lasted a lifetime, he sighed. It was a weary, put-upon sound. He walked past me, over to the bedroom window that overlooked the pristine, sun-drenched street. He placed his hands on the sill and stared out, his back to me. "Richard?" I whispered, my voice trembling with confusion and a dawning, terrible fear. He took a deep breath, still looking outside, and then he spoke. His voice wasn't angry, it wasn't sad, it was flat, calm, and devastatingly rational. "Well, Lily," he said, the words dropping into the silent room like stones into a deep well. "What did you expect? Maybe you shouldn't have been alone with him." The world did not dissolve. It shattered. The air in my lungs turned to glass. The sounds of the room, the birds outside, the ticking clock on the bedside table, my own frantic heartbeat, vanished. There was only a high, thin ringing in my ears. His words hung in the air, monstrous and obscene in their simplicity. They were not just an accusation, they were a verdict. A confirmation. He had taken the most profound trauma of my life and, with a few casual words, laid it at my feet as if it were a mess of my own making. In that moment, I finally understood. Marcus hadn't been the true monster of the story. He was just a weapon, a brutal, simple instrument. The true horror, the architect of my despair, was the man standing at the window with his back to me. Marcus had violated my body, a violent, terrible act that left me scarred and terrified. But Richard had just reached into my chest, taken my soul in his hands, and deliberately, methodically, crushed it into dust. He had looked at my deepest wound and, instead of healing it, poured salt into it and told me I deserved the pain. The fairy tale was over. The man I had married, the man I had built my life around, the man who was my last and only hope, was a stranger. And I was utterly, irrevocably alone. That one sentence did not just hang in the air. It solidified, building a wall of ice between us, right there in the sunlit bedroom. For a long time, I didn't move. I couldn't. I was a fly trapped in amber, preserved in the exact moment my universe collapsed. I watched him turn from the window, his face composed, as if he had just commented on the weather. He ran a hand through his hair and looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time since he'd come home. There was no pity in his eyes. There was no anger. There was only a cool, appraising quality, the look a scientist might give a specimen under a microscope. "Let's go downstairs," he said, his voice even. "I'll make some coffee." And just like that, the world, which had stopped, was forced to spin again. He walked out of the room, and after a moment that felt like an eternity, my feet followed. I was no longer in control. My body was a vessel, and my mind was a terrified passenger, watching from a great distance as my hands picked up my discarded robe, as my feet padded down the familiar wooden stairs. The days that followed were a study in surreal horror. Nothing changed, and yet everything had. The sun still rose, the mail was still delivered, the phone still rang. Richard went to work each morning, kissing me on the cheek with the same dry dispassion he had before he left for Boston. On the surface, our life was a placid, undisturbed pond, but beneath, in the silent, suffocating depths, a monster now lived. The house was no longer my home. It was a stage. Every action was a performance. When I made the bed, my hands smoothing sheets on his side, I felt a wave of nausea. When I cooked dinner, the familiar scent of roasting garlic would turn my stomach. I was living in a perfect replica of my life, but it was a replica built over a sinkhole, and I was in a constant state of vertigo, terrified of the ground giving way. We never spoke of it again. The event became a non-thing, an un-memory. To speak its name would be to acknowledge its reality, and Richard had made it clear that my reality was not the accepted one. He had rewritten the truth, and I was expected to live within the pages of his new draft. About a month later, the first test came. Richard was at his desk in the living room, going over some legal briefs. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, my hands submerged in hot, soapy water. "Poker night on Friday," he announced, not looking up from his papers. "The usual guys are coming over. Marcus will probably be here a little early to help set up. The plate I was holding slipped from my grasp, shattering in the sink with a sound like a gunshot. My heart seized. Cold dread, slick and oily, coated my throat. I have a book club meeting on Friday, I lied, my voice thin and reedy. I won't be home. He finally looked up. His eyes were flat, devoid of emotion. You canceled the book club, Lily. Remember? You told me last week you were too tired. He was right. I had been too tired. I was always too tired. The exhaustion was a physical weight, a lead blanket I couldn't shrug off. Don't be difficult, he said, his voice dropping into that same chillingly reasonable tone from the bedroom. It's just Marcus. He needs to pick up the new fishing rods I ordered for him anyway. His gaze held mine, and in it was a clear, unspoken command. You will be here. You will be compliant. To refuse was not an option. It would be to admit that something was wrong, and we were living in a world where nothing was wrong. The dread began on Friday morning and built throughout the day, a slow, creeping sickness. By the time evening fell, I felt like I was walking underwater. Every sound was magnified, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a dog barking. When I heard the familiar rumble of Marcus's truck in the driveway, my body went rigid. Richard met him at the door, a booming, "Look what the cat dragged in," and a hearty clap on the back. They were laughing, best friends. Nothing had changed. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to be busy arranging crackers on a tray, my back to the door. "Hey, Lilypad," Marcus's voice called out, using the old affectionate nickname that now felt like a curse. I couldn't turn. I couldn't speak. Richard saved me. Lily's not feeling great, a bit under the weather. He was creating the narrative for me, the fragile wife. The moody recluse. I felt Marcus's presence behind me, a looming shadow. I could feel his eyes on my back. "Oh, that's too bad," he said, his voice thick with false sympathy. "Anything I can do?" "No," Richard said smoothly. "I've got it handled." "Why don't you grab the card table from the garage? The guys will be here any minute." He was sent away. I could breathe again, my lungs aching. But it was only a temporary reprieve, a stay of execution. The poker game was loud and full of smoke and laughter. I retreated upstairs, pleading a headache, but I couldn't escape the sound of his voice drifting up the stairs, loud and confident. I lay in bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, my entire body a knot of tension, waiting for the sound of the other guests leaving. And when they did, when the last car pulled away and the house fell silent, I heard Richard's voice from the bottom of the stairs. "Marcus is staying to help me clean up. I'm just running down to the all-night market to get more beer for us." The lie was so bald, so transparent. It stole the air from my lungs. And I knew this was the design, this was the routine. This became the pattern of my life. It was a prison built of ordinary days. There would be a poker night, a fishing trip, a Sunday afternoon watching football. Richard would create the opportunity, manufacturing a reason to leave me alone with him. I learned to read the signs, to feel the shift in the atmosphere in the days leading up to it. A certain terse quality in Richard's voice, a casual mention of Marcus's name dropped into conversation. Each time, a new wave of helpless terror would wash over me. I tried to fight it in small ways. I would schedule appointments I didn't need. I would invent errands to run, but Richard was always one step ahead, calmly and logically dismantling my excuses, boxing me in until there was nowhere left to run. He was the master architect of my torment. The joy drained from my life like color from a photograph left in the sun. My work at the library, once a source of pleasure, became a trial. The well-meaning questions from my colleagues, "Are you all right, Lily?" Or, is. "You seem so distant," were impossible to answer. My friends stopped calling as often when my excuses for not joining them became more frequent and less plausible. My world shrank to the walls of my house. And within those walls, I became a ghost. I learned to dissociate, to send my mind away to a safe, gray, featureless place while my body endured. It was a survival mechanism, but each time I did it, I felt a little piece of myself chip away, lost forever. I would look in the mirror and see a stranger with haunted eyes and a mouth set in a permanent thin line of tension. The town, our perfect little Maple Creek, became a gallery of judging eyes. At the grocery store, I could feel their whispers behind my back.
Helen Parrish cornered me by the produce one afternoon, her face a mask of cloying concern. "Lily, dear," she said, placing a hand on my arm. I flinched.
"We're all so worried. Richard works so hard and you just seem so fragile lately. You have to take better care of yourself." For his sake, the narrative was set. Poor, brilliant Richard saddled with a difficult, neurotic wife. He played the part of the patient, long-suffering husband to perfection. No one saw the jailer. They only saw the saint. And they saw me as the reason for his cross. I was utterly, completely trapped, not just by two men, but by the crushing weight of a whole town's misplaced sympathy. This was my life now. A silent, unending scream inside a prison of routine. The prison of routine has a strange effect on the senses. At first it dulls them, a self-preservation mechanism against the relentless trauma. The world becomes gray and muffled, but as the months bled into a year and then another, something else began to happen. The fear, which had been a blunt, heavy instrument, started to sharpen. It honed my perception to a razor's edge. I was still a ghost, but now I was a watchful one. I became a collector of moments, a silent archivist of glances, tones, and silences that didn't quite fit. My life was a tightly choreographed performance, and I began to notice the stage directions I was never meant to see. I noticed how Richard's hand would tighten on his coffee cup when I mentioned feeling unwell. I noticed how Marcus, who once filled every room with his booming presence, now seemed to shrink when I entered, his gaze sliding away to a fixed point on the wall. They moved around me with a careful, deliberate choreography, like two men handling unstable material. I was the unstable material. The first truly discordant note sounded on a bright, cold Saturday morning. Richard and Marcus were in the kitchen, packing a cooler for a fishing trip. The air was thick with their easy camaraderie, a sound that had become a prelude to my own private horror. I was taking a glass from a high shelf when a wave of dizziness, sudden and overwhelming, washed over me. The glass slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor. I swayed, grabbing the edge of the counter to steady myself. "Lily!" Richard was at my side instantly, his hand on my elbow, guiding me to a chair. "Just sit down. You're white as a sheet." His voice was a performance of concern, pitch perfect for his audience of one. "I'm fine," I murmured, my head spinning. "Just stood up too fast." As I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I looked up. Over my head, a look passed between Richard and Marcus. It was fleeting, no more than a second, but I saw it with my new, sharpened clarity. It was not a look of shared concern for me. It was not sympathy. It was something else entirely. It was the detached, assessing look of two farmers checking their livestock, of two scientists observing a variable in an experiment. It was a look that said, "Is this part of the process? Is this a sign?" The glance was a silent, complete conversation, and I was the subject, not the participant. The coldness of it was more profound than the dizziness. For the first time, I felt a flicker of suspicion that went beyond Richard's simple, cruel indifference. That flicker became a slow burn a few months later. Richard's law practice, which he had started with more ambition than capital, had been a source of constant, low-grade stress in our house. I was used to the sight of him, hunched over ledgers at the dining room table late at night, his face grim. I knew the stack of unpaid bills he kept in his top desk drawer. Then, almost overnight, it all changed. He came home one evening, his step lighter than it had been in years. He was smiling that old, charming smile, the one I now knew to be a well-rehearsed lie. He announced he was hiring a paralegal, leasing the adjacent office space. He was expanding. "That's wonderful, Richard," I said, a knot of confusion tightening in my stomach. "But how? Where did the money come from?" He waved a dismissive hand, walking to the liquor cabinet to pour himself a celebratory whiskey. "You're not going to believe it. Marcus, the guy's a saint. He came into a small inheritance and offered me a loan." "A substantial one,"
Said he believed in me, wanted to invest in my future. He raised his glass in a toast to the empty air. To the best friend a man could ask for. The story was perfect.
It was plausible, generous, and painted both men in the most flattering light. But it felt wrong. Deeply wrong. My mind, now an instrument of suspicion, began to make calculations. The timing of the loan, coming after nearly 2 years of this horrifying, unspoken routine. It didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a transaction, a payment for services rendered. The thought was so monstrous, so insane, that I tried to push it away. But it lodged in my mind like a shard of glass, too deep to be removed. The final piece fell into place on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I'd left the library early, a migraine pounding behind my eyes. I let myself in through the back door, wanting only to crawl into my bed in a dark room. As I passed the hallway, I heard voices from Richard's study, his and Marcus's. They were supposed to be out at a client meeting. My heart began to pound, a frantic drum against my ribs. I froze, pressing myself into the shadows of the hall. Their voices weren't the usual boisterous laughter. They were low, tense, urgent. "It's getting risky," Marcus was saying, his voice a strained whisper. "She looks like a ghost. Helen Parrish asked me at the post office if everything was all right, if Lily was ill. People are starting to talk." There was a pause, then Richard's voice, cold and sharp as splintered ice. "I don't care what Helen Parrish thinks. Just stick to the plan. It's too late to back out now." "We are too close." "But is it even working?" Marcus pressed, a desperate edge to his words. "It's been so long, nothing's happening." "It will work," Richard snapped, his voice a low, vicious command. "It has to. Now stop losing your nerve and be careful. That's all you need to do. Plan." Risky. Working. Close. The words detonated in the quiet hallway, blowing apart the last remnants of the world I thought I knew. I backed away silently, my hand over my mouth to stifle a sob, and crept upstairs. I locked my bedroom door and slid down to the floor, my mind racing, connecting the dots with a terrifying, sickening speed. The glance in the kitchen. The sudden influx of money. The hushed, vicious argument. It all clicked into place, forming a picture so monstrous it defied imagination. This wasn't a pattern of abuse that Richard simply allowed. This wasn't the work of a cruel husband and his opportunistic friend. This was a design. A meticulous, long-term project. I was living in a play where everyone knew their lines but me, where my suffering was not a byproduct, but the central plot point. The gaslighting, the isolation, the recurring horror, it was all part of it. A plan. My despair, which had been a vast, murky ocean, now had a focal point. It was no longer the passive sorrow of a victim. It was the active terror of an instrument. I was a tool, being used for a purpose I couldn't fathom. The central question that had haunted me for years, "Why is this happening to me?" was suddenly obsolete. It was replaced by a new, colder, and infinitely more terrifying question. What was the plan? And what, in God's name, was it supposed to be working towards? The knowledge of a plan changed the nature of my fear. It was no longer a shapeless, ambient dread that I lived within, like a perpetual fog. It became a sharp, specific, and active thing. I was a prisoner who had just discovered the blueprints to her own jail, even if I couldn't yet decipher their meaning. My senses, already honed by years of terror, sharpened further. I became a spy in my own home, every cell in my body attuned to the silent conspiracy that surrounded me. I watched them. I watched the way Richard's eyes would scan my body when he thought I wasn't looking, a quick clinical inventory. I watched the way Marcus would ask about my health, his voice layered with a false, strained concern that felt heavier than any threat. Their words were a code I couldn't crack, their actions movements in a ritual whose purpose was a terrifying mystery. The words I'd overheard in the hall became my catechism, a prayer of damnation I recited in the darkness of my sleepless nights. Plan. Risky. Working. Close. And I began to watch myself. The persistent fatigue that had become my constant companion. The waves of nausea that would rise unexpectedly, forcing me to grip the edge of a table until they passed. The dizzy spells that left the world tilting on its axis. For years, I had accepted these as the natural consequences of living in a state of constant terror. My body, I assumed, was simply breaking down under the strain of my life. But now, with the chilling question from Marcus, is it even working? Echoing in my mind, I began to see these symptoms in a new, horrifying light. What if they weren't the byproducts of the plan? What if they were the intended result? The thought was so grotesque, so profoundly insane, that my mind recoiled from it. And yet, it took root. The breaking point came one Tuesday morning at the library. I was shelving books in the history section, the quiet, dusty scent of old paper a small comfort. I reached for a high shelf, and the world simply tilted and went black. I woke up on the floor, the rough carpet scratching my cheek, with my boss, Mrs. Gable, kneeling beside me, her face a mask of alarm. "Lily, that's it," she said, her voice firm but kind. "You are seeing Dr. Miller today. I'm making the appointment myself." The walk to Dr. Miller's office was a walk through a dream. The familiar streets of Maple Creek, the cheerful storefronts, the greetings from neighbors. It all felt distant, unreal. I sat in the waiting room, turning the pages of a magazine without seeing a single word. A cold, heavy certainty was beginning to form in the pit of my stomach. When the nurse finally called my name, I felt like a woman walking to the gallows. Doctor. Miller was a kind, round-faced man who had been my doctor since I first moved to town. He listened patiently as I described my symptoms, his pen scratching against his notepad. "Exhaustion, nausea, dizzy spells," he murmured, nodding. "It sounds like you've been under a great deal of stress, Lily." He ran his tests. He drew blood. He asked me to lie on the examination table, his hands cool and professional as he pressed on my abdomen. I stared at the acoustic tiles of the ceiling, each one pockmarked with tiny, irregular holes, and I felt a profound and complete detachment from the body he was examining. It was not mine. It was a piece of evidence in a crime I was only just beginning to understand. He finished his examination and sat on the stool across from me, a small, paternal smile on his face. He took off his glasses and polished them with a handkerchief. "Well, Lily," he said, his voice gentle. "It appears the source of your trouble is not an illness at all. In fact, some would call it a blessing." He paused, letting the smile broaden. "You're pregnant." "About 10 weeks along, I'd say." The world went silent. The gentle hum of the office ventilation, the distant sound of traffic, Dr. Miller's cheerful voice. It all faded into a dull, roaring vacuum. He was still talking, saying words like congratulations and prenatal care, but they were just meaningless sounds. My gaze was fixed on my own hands, lying in my lap. They were trembling. So violently, this was it. This was the answer. This was the horrifying, unthinkable purpose of the plan. It had worked. The drive home was a blur. I don't remember the turns I took or the traffic lights I stopped at. I was trapped in the landscape of my own mind, the final, terrible pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, the years of systematic violation. The money that had passed between them. The hushed, urgent talk of a plan that was working. It had all been for this. This life growing inside me was not the product of love or even of a single violent mistake. It was the result of a long-term, meticulously executed project. I walked into the house. Richard was in the living room, reading the evening paper. He looked up as I entered, a question in his eyes. I didn't have the strength to be strategic, to hide it. The truth was a dead weight I could no longer carry. "I went to see Dr. Miller," I said. My voice was flat, empty of all emotion. "He ran some tests." I watched his face. I saw the subtle tensing of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. He was waiting. "I'm pregnant," I said. And then I saw the one thing that confirmed every last horrifying suspicion. He didn't feign surprise. He didn't pretend to be angry or confused. His face, for the first time in years, broke into a smile of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was the most genuine expression I had seen from him since our wedding day. It was a victor's smile. "Finally," he breathed.
a wave of profound relief washing over his features. He dropped the newspaper and crossed the room to me in 2 long strides. He pulled me into an embrace, but it was not the embrace of a loving husband. It was the embrace of a man taking possession of his prize. He held me tightly, his hand resting proprietarily on my stomach. "Everything is going to be okay now, Lily," he whispered into my hair, his voice thick with emotion. "Our family is complete." I stood frozen in his arms, a statue carved from ice. And in the chilling warmth of his triumphant embrace, the absolute bone-deep truth settled over me. This was never about love or marriage or partnership. This wasn't just abuse that Richard had passively allowed. This was a service he had procured. My body had been a vessel, my life a means to an end. I was not a wife. I was an incubator. And this child, this innocent life inside me, was not our baby. It was the product of a monstrous bargain, the living proof of a transaction so vile it defied comprehension. I had finally discovered the purpose of my prison. It was to be a nursery. The 9 months that followed were the longest war of my life, a silent, internal siege conducted within the walls of my own body. Outwardly, I was the very picture of a serene, expectant mother. Richard had insisted I stop working at the library, framing it as a loving gesture to ensure I wasn't under any stress. In reality, it was the final bar on my cage, severing my last tie to an independent life. I went to my prenatal appointments. I nodded as Dr. Miller told me the baby was healthy and growing perfectly. I accepted the small, cooing gifts from neighbors who now saw me not as a fragile woman, but as a vessel for the town's next generation, a purpose they could understand and approve of. Richard was magnificent in his role as the doting father-to-be. He painted a room a soft, neutral blue. He assembled a crib with his own hands, the picture of domestic pride. He would rest his hand on my swollen abdomen, a look of profound satisfaction on his face, and speak of the future. "My son will play football," he'd say. "I'll teach him to fish, just like my father taught me." He spoke of my son, my heir, my legacy. The words were possessive, absolute. I was merely the container, the fertile ground in which he had finally managed to plant his flag. He and Marcus were closer than ever, bonded by their triumphant secret. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, drinking beer and talking in low, confident tones, their gazes often drifting towards me where I sat, a silent, swollen figure in the fading light. Their shared glances were no longer furtive or anxious. They were smug. They were the looks of 2 men admiring a project nearing its successful completion. They had won. They had gotten everything they wanted. For months, I felt a chilling disconnect from the life fluttering inside me. It was not a part of me. It was an alien presence, a living symbol of the Pact, a constant physical reminder of the violation. I would feel a kick, a turn, and a wave of cold revulsion would wash over me. This was their creation. How could I love it? How could I not see it as the ultimate evidence of my own destruction? But as my body grew heavier and the time drew near, a slow, seismic shift began to occur within me. The movements became stronger, more defined, the sharp jab of an elbow, the slow roll of a turning body. They were not just flutters anymore. They were the assertions of a separate being, an individual soul. And a new, terrifying thought began to take hold. This child, this innocent, had not asked for any of this. He was as much a victim of their monstrous plan as I was. My fear, which had been so wholly focused on myself, began to transform. It expanded, reoriented, and became a fierce, protective terror for the helpless child I carried. He was not their product. He was a prisoner, just like me. And a mother does not abandon her child in a prison. The birth was a trial of fire and ice, a brutal, agonizing ordeal that ripped the world down to nothing but pain and breath. Richard was by my side, a perfect facsimile of a supportive husband. He held my hand, he wiped my brow with a cool cloth, he whispered words of encouragement. "You're doing great, Lily. He's almost here. Our son is almost here." His presence was a source of profound, icy profanity in that sacred primal space. His words of encouragement were the cheers of my jailer. I closed my eyes and focused on the pain, using it as a shield, a wall to keep him out. And then,
After an eternity, it was over. A cry, thin and furious, cut through the exhausted haze of the room. A new life, here in the world. A nurse, her face a kind, blurry smile, cleaned him and wrapped him in a soft white blanket. "You have a beautiful, healthy boy, Lily," she said. She placed the warm, wriggling bundle in my arms, and the world stopped. Everything, the pain, the exhaustion, Richard's triumphant voice, the sterile smell of the hospital, it all fell away. I looked down at the tiny wrinkled face, the shock of dark hair, the small pursed mouth. His eyes, a deep slate gray, blinked open and looked right at me, and in that one shattering moment, the universe reconfigured itself. The ice in my chest, the cold hard knot of despair I had carried for years, did not melt. It was transmuted. It hardened into something else entirely, a diamond-hard, crystalline resolve. The fear was gone, burned away by a white-hot protective fury so potent it left me breathless. This was not a product. This was not a symbol of my violation. This was my son. My son, flesh of my flesh, born of my suffering, and utterly, completely mine. A fierce, primal love, more powerful than anything I had ever known, flooded every cell of my being. It was an ocean, and it washed away the last remnants of the broken, terrified woman I had been. I named him Noah. Richard leaned over me, beaming down at the baby in my arms. "He's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with pride. "He has your eyes." He reached out to touch Noah's cheek, and on pure instinct, I shifted slightly, turning the baby's body more fully towards mine, a small, almost imperceptible act of shielding. It was the first act of my new life. Richard didn't notice. He was lost in his victory. He saw the completion of his plan, the continuation of his name, the living proof of his own cleverness and power. He saw his legacy. But as I held my son, breathing in the sweet, clean scent of his skin, I made a silent, solemn vow. I looked at this tiny, innocent soul, and I swore that he would never be defined by the sins of the men who had conspired to create him. I would protect him. I would raise him in love and truth, no matter the cost. And I would have justice, not the loud, clumsy justice of a courtroom. I knew that was impossible. Richard was too respected, too powerful. They would paint me as an unstable, vindictive woman. They would turn my own son into a spectacle. No. My justice would be of a different kind. It would be quiet, patient, and absolute. It would be a justice of the soul. Richard and Marcus thought they had written the story, that this was the final chapter. They were wrong. Holding Noah, I understood with chilling clarity. My life wasn't over. It had just been given a purpose. I was no longer a victim or a prisoner. I was a mother, and I would be the one to write the final, devastating chapter of their legacy. They had planted a seed of horror, but they had underestimated what a mother would do to protect her child. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. When I brought Noah home from the hospital, the house felt different. It was the same space, with the same furniture and the same ghosts, but I was no longer a phantom within it. I was a queen returning to her castle, carrying the sole heir, and my mind was a fortress. Richard and Marcus were there, their faces glowing with a proprietary pride that turned my stomach. They saw me as the vessel that had successfully delivered their precious cargo. I let them see that. My performance began the moment I crossed the threshold. I played the part of a woman hollowed out by childbirth and overwhelmed by the demands of a newborn. I was quiet, tired, and grateful for Richard's help. I allowed him to take the lead, to make the decisions, to feel the full, magnificent weight of his new patriarchal power. He saw a wife who had been tamed by motherhood, her spirit finally broken and reshaped into something domestic and compliant. His guard came down. Complacency is the handmaiden of arrogance, and my husband was a very arrogant man. He believed he had won the war. He had no idea I was just beginning to draw my maps and marshal my forces. The years that followed were a masterclass in patience. Time was measured in Noah's growth. The sleepless nights of his infancy melted into the toddling chaos of his early years. His first word was "Mama." His first steps were taken towards my open arms. These were victories I savored in secret. I was his sun, his moon, and his entire world, and I built a fortress of love around him so strong that no darkness could permeate it. To Richard, I was simply a mother, a biological function. He had no concept of the fierce intellectual and spiritual bond I was forging with my son. My strategy was twofold. First, I had to raise a good man. Not a strong man in the way Richard or Marcus would define it, but a man of empathy, integrity, and perception. Second, I had to instill in him a deep, instinctual distrust of the man who was, by blood, his father. The second task had to be accomplished without ever speaking a single negative word. It had to be a lesson taught through the air, through silence, through the subtle language of a body under siege. When Noah was a toddler, learning to navigate the world on his chubby, unsteady legs, Marcus would visit, his presence filling our home with a false joviality. "There's my little guy," he'd boom, reaching for Noah. The first time he tried to pick him up, I swooped in with a tight, brittle smile. "Oh, he's feeling a bit clingy today," I said, pulling Noah into the safety of my own arms. A real mama's boy. My voice was light, but my body was rigid, my arms a barricade. Noah, who understood the world through my reactions, felt my tension and buried his face in my shoulder. It was the first lesson. This man is not safe. As Noah grew, the lessons became more nuanced. For his 5th birthday, Marcus arrived with a huge, flashy remote control car, a gift far too expensive and complex for a 5-year-old. Noah's eyes went wide. Richard beamed, clapping Marcus on the back. "You're spoiling him, old friend." I allowed Noah to thank him, to play with it for the rest of the afternoon under Marcus's smug supervision. But that evening, after Marcus had gone, I quietly put the car on the highest shelf in the closet. "It's a very special toy," I told Noah, whose face was beginning to fall. "We should save it for when you're older, so it doesn't break." I then pulled out a set of simple wooden blocks he loved. The unspoken lesson. Gifts from this man are conditional, complicated. Joy from this man is not real joy. The most effective poison, however, was associating Marcus's presence with my own pain. After one of his Sunday visits, after Noah had been subjected to an hour of his loud jokes and backslapping familiarity, I would retreat. "Mommy has one of her bad headaches," I would tell Noah, my voice a weak whisper. I'd go to my bedroom, draw the curtains, and lie in the darkness. Noah, who adored me with the fierce, pure love of a child, would sit outside my door, a little sentinel guarding his wounded mother. He never saw me cry. He only saw the aftermath. He began to connect the dots in his own young mind. Uncle Marcus visits, and Mommy gets hurt. His childish dislike of the loud man who took his mother away from him began to curdle into a deeper, more serious aversion. While I was shaping Noah's soul, I was also fortifying my own. One sweltering afternoon, years later when Noah was at a summer day camp, I decided to tackle the attic, a dusty, neglected space filled with the ghosts of our past. I was looking for old photograph albums, wanting to show Noah pictures of his grandparents. I moved dusty boxes and old furniture, the air thick with the scent of aging paper and cedar. In a far corner, tucked under a collection of my old college textbooks, was a small, sealed cardboard box I didn't recognize. It had Richard's name on it, written in his mother's spidery handwriting. Curiosity, a feeling I had suppressed for years, got the better of me. My heart pounding, I slit the tape with a pair of old scissors. Inside were mementos from his university days, a fraternity paddle, a stack of letters from an old girlfriend, yearbooks. And inside, a heavy economics textbook, used as a press, was a single folded piece of paper. It was an old letter, the letterhead from a university health clinic yellowed with age. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The language was clinical, formal, and utterly devastating. It was a follow-up from a doctor regarding a severe case of mumps Richard had suffered in his late teens. It spoke of inflammation, of irreversible damage. And then the final sentence, a sterile medical pronouncement that was the absolute core of my life's great lie. The results of the semen analysis confirm complete azoospermia. In layman's terms, the damage has resulted in permanent sterility. Sterility. Not low fertility, not a challenge. Permanent. Absolute. I sank back on my heels, the letter shaking in my hand. I felt not a shock of discovery, but a cold, profound, and terrible validation. This was it. The truth. The secret he had carried into our marriage. The reason for the pact, for the plan, for the buying and selling of souls. This piece of paper was the bedrock of my reality, the anchor that would keep me sane and steady for the long years ahead. I didn't need it for a court. I didn't need it to show anyone. I just needed to know that I knew. I carefully refolded the letter, placed it back within the pages of the heavy textbook, and sealed the box. I pushed it back into the corner, burying it under the other relics of his past. The secret was safer there than anywhere on earth. I went downstairs and washed my hands, feeling a new, cold strength coursing through me. My long game was not based on suspicion or paranoia. It was based on a fact as hard and unchangeable as granite. The years passed. Noah grew from a bright, inquisitive boy into a tall, thoughtful young man who shared my love for books and quiet observation. He was everything Richard was not: gentle, intuitive, and possessed of a quiet integrity that was his alone. The day before he was set to leave for college, Marcus stopped by. The years had not been as kind to him. He was heavier, his face florid, his charm showing its frayed edges. "Came to wish the college man good luck," Marcus said, extending a hand to Noah. He pressed an envelope into Noah's other hand. "A little something to help with books." Noah took the handshake, but it was brief, his grip cool and disengaged. He glanced at the envelope and handed it back. "Thank you, Uncle Marcus, but I'm fine. My mom and I have it covered." His voice was polite, but there was an unmistakable wall of ice behind it. He looked at Marcus with a quiet, steady dislike, an emotion so ingrained he no longer questioned its origin. Richard, standing nearby, saw a moody, ungrateful teenager. Marcus saw an arrogant kid, but I, watching from the kitchen doorway, saw the beautiful, terrible fruit of my 2-decade-long labor. The seeds I had so carefully, so silently planted had grown into a mighty tree, and its roots had cracked the very foundation of their monstrous world. The harvest was coming. The final act of my long game began not with a bang, but with a doctor's somber, quiet words. Terminal. The word hung in the air of our house, a new kind of ghost, but this one had a timeline. Richard, the man who had seemed an indomitable force of nature, was dying. The cancer in his lungs was aggressive, a dark mirror of the man it was consuming. His illness transformed our home into a hushed sick room. He spent most of his days in his worn leather armchair in the study, or in his bed, a diminished king ruling over a shrinking kingdom of medicine bottles and oxygen tubes. His body was failing, but his pride, that monstrous, unshakable pride, remained intact. He grew sentimental, speaking often of his legacy, of the good life he had built, the name he had secured. He would look at Noah, who had come home from college to help, with a watery, possessive affection. "He'll carry on the name," Richard would rasp to me, a wheezing satisfaction in his voice. "He's a good boy. My son." Noah was a quiet, constant presence that final autumn. He was good to his father, treating him with a gentle, dutiful patience that was agonizing to watch. He would help him from his chair, bring him his meals, and read to him from the newspaper. But there was a vast, unbridgeable distance in his courtesy. He cared for the dying man, but he did not love the father. He was simply being the good man I had raised him to be. I watched them, and I knew the time had come. My long game was never about watching Richard wither away from disease. That was nature's justice, not mine. My justice was for Noah. It was the reclamation of his truth. I could not let Richard die and take the lie with him, leaving it to be carved on his tombstone, cementing himself in memory as the noble patriarch. The truth had to be unveiled while its architect was still there to witness it. It was a Tuesday evening in October. A cold rain was falling outside, tapping against the window panes. Richard was in his study, dozing in his chair. Noah was in the living room, just across the hall, reading under a pool of lamplight, a scene of quiet domesticity. I saw the geometry of the moment, the perfect alignment of the pieces on my chessboard. After 20 years of waiting, the final move was here. I entered the study, carrying a fresh glass of water for him. I placed it on the table beside him, my movements calm and deliberate.
Richard, I said softly. He stirred, his eyes blinking open. Lily, he rasped, his voice thin. There's something we need to talk about, I said, my voice as smooth and cool as the water in the glass. I walked over to the heavy oak door of the study and pushed it, not quite closing it, leaving a small, dark crack, a sliver of an opening just wide enough for sound to travel. I had practiced the angle for weeks. I turned back to him and took the seat opposite his armchair. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old books and impending death. He looked at me, a flicker of irritation in his tired eyes. What is it? I was sleeping. I was in the attic today, I began, my voice a quiet conversational hum, looking through some of your old things, from before we were married. He shifted, his unease a subtle tremor. What about it? I know about your infertility, Richard, I said. The words fell into the quiet room, clear and precise. I know you've been sterile since you were 19 years old. His face, already pale and sunken, seemed to collapse. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a waxy gray pallor. For the first time in our nearly 50 years together, I saw genuine, unadulterated shock in his eyes. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. You're crazy, he finally stammered. Losing your mind. I didn't raise my voice. I leaned forward slightly, my gaze steady. Am I, or did you make a deal, a pact with your best friend? A business arrangement, his services, in exchange for the money to start your law practice. I laid the facts out like cards on a table, one by one. You couldn't give me a child, so you had Marcus do it for you. You didn't just allow me to be violated, Richard. You orchestrated it. You procured it. You bought my son. He stared at me, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The shock on his face was warring with something else, a lifetime of arrogance, a deep, pathological need to be the one in control. He looked at my calm, certain face, and I could see the moment he made his choice. He would not crumble. He would not apologize. He would own it. A strange, gurgling sound started in his chest. It was a laugh, a weak, wheezing, triumphant laugh that was more horrifying than any scream. You are a clever woman, Lily, he choked out, a grotesque smile twisting his lips. Much more clever than I ever gave you credit for. He leaned back in his chair, a pathetic imitation of his old, confident posture. So you figured it out. What of it? I did what I had to do. A man needs a legacy. A son. Marcus was a means to an end. Unpleasant, perhaps, but necessary. He looked past me, a faraway, victorious glint in his dying eyes. And look at him, Lily. Look at Noah. He's smart. He's strong. He's perfect. He is my son. He carries my name. I won. In the end, whatever it took, I won. The words hung in the air, a testament to a monstrosity so profound it defied reason. He had declared his victory, and in the ringing silence that followed his declaration, a floorboard creaked in the hall. The study door, which had been resting just ajar, swung slowly, silently inward. My gaze lifted from Richard's face, past his pathetic, triumphant smile, to the doorway. Standing there, his face illuminated by the soft light from the hall, was Noah. He was holding the book he had been reading, but it was forgotten in his hand. His face was a mask of absolute cataclysmic horror. I watched as his mind struggled to process the words he had just heard, the words that had just dismantled his entire life. I saw the confusion give way to disbelief, the disbelief curdle into a dawning, sickened comprehension. I saw the moment he understood, the color drained from his face, his eyes wide and shattered. He looked at the man in the chair, the man he had called father his entire life, and then he looked at me. A small, choked sound escaped his lips, the sound of a soul breaking. The truth, in all its ugliness, was finally out. And my son was standing in the wreckage. The silence in the study was a physical thing, a thick, heavy pressure that muted the sound of the rain outside. Richard's triumphant, wheezing laugh had died in his throat, his face frozen in a grotesque mask of victory, just as he caught sight of the figure in the doorway.
His eyes, which had been fixed on some glorious internal vision of his own legacy, now darted between me and the ghost that had just appeared. Our ghost. Our son. Noah stood motionless, his body framed by the doorway, a figure carved from shock. The book he'd been holding slipped from his fingers, landing on the hardwood floor with a soft, definitive thud. The sound broke the spell. He took a slow, deliberate step into the room, and then another. He moved with the stiff, unnatural grace of a sleepwalker, his eyes locked on the man in the armchair. It was not a look of anger or of sadness. It was a look of profound and horrifying discovery, the look of someone who has just lifted a familiar stone to find a nest of writhing poison underneath. "Noah," Richard began, his voice a strangled rasp. He tried to push himself up in his chair, to regain some semblance of authority. "Noah, you don't understand. Let me explain." Noah did not let him finish. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply continued his slow, inexorable advance until he stood directly before Richard's chair, looking down at the frail, dying man who had orchestrated his existence. He looked at the man who had stolen his mother's life, who had bought and sold him like property. He saw the full, unvarnished truth of the monster before him, stripped bare of the costume of father he had worn for 20 years. And then he passed his judgment. His voice was not loud, it was quiet, devoid of heat, and for that reason, it was as final and as absolute as death itself. "You," Noah said, his voice perfectly steady, "are not my father." The words were a blade. They slid into Richard with a clean, surgical precision, severing the last thread that tethered him to his monstrous pride. His face, which had been a mask of shock, crumpled. The arrogance, the defiance, the lifetime of carefully constructed self-importance, it all collapsed inward, leaving nothing but a pathetic, broken old man in a leather chair. His victory had been rendered utterly, comically meaningless. The legacy he had sacrificed everything for had just looked him in the eye and disowned him. He had lost. In the final moment of the game, he had lost everything. Noah held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned, his face a stone mask of grief. His eyes met mine, and in that one look, a universe of shared pain and understanding passed between us. There was no accusation, only a deep, sorrowful recognition. He knew what my life had been. He knew what I had endured, and he knew why. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of solidarity that bound us together in our shared, terrible truth. Then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the man who was now just a dying stranger. The days that followed were lived in a state of quiet, suspended animation. Noah spoke to me, his voice gentle, his actions full of a new protective care. He never spoke of that night in the study, but it was a constant, living presence between us. To Richard, he said nothing at all. He continued to bring the man his meals and his medicine, but he did so with the detached efficiency of a hired nurse. He would not meet his eye. He would not respond to his wheezing attempts at conversation. He had pronounced his judgment, and for him, Richard Anderson had ceased to exist. About a week later, Noah came to me in the kitchen. "I need to go to the store," he said, his voice calm. But I saw the look in his eyes, the cold, clear resolve. This was not about groceries. I only nodded. "I'll be here." The Maple Creek General Store was the town's central nervous system, a place of commerce and a clearinghouse for gossip. On a Saturday morning, it was bustling, and as I knew he would be, Marcus was there. He was leaning against the counter by the cash register, holding court, his voice booming as he recounted some story to a small, captive audience. He was in his element, the charming, affable pillar of the community, blissfully unaware that his world was about to end. Noah walked into the store. The bell above the door chimed and a few heads turned. He moved through the aisles with a quiet purpose, his face unreadable. He walked directly to the counter where Marcus stood laughing. He did not say a word. He just stood there, waiting. Slowly, the laughter died down. Marcus's story faltered. The people around him sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden drop in temperature. Marcus finally turned and saw Noah standing there. "Noah." "Hey, kid," he said, his bonhomie sounding suddenly forced. "What's up? Home from the big city to see your old man?"
Noah didn't smile. He let the silence stretch for a moment, his gaze level and cold. His voice when he spoke was not loud, but it cut through the low hum of the store with chilling clarity. "I know what you are," Noah said. Marcus's smile froze on his face. He gave a nervous chuckle. "What's that supposed to mean? Got a little too much college in you, kid?" Noah ignored him, his eyes like chips of ice. "And I want you to know," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, more intimately, "that every time you see me, for the rest of your life, you will be reminded that you are nothing." He didn't say what Marcus was. He didn't name the crime. The ambiguity of the accusation was its genius. It was a charge of moral bankruptcy, a judgment so complete it needed no specifics. He had held up a mirror, and he was letting the whole town see the monster reflected within it. Noah held his gaze for one more second, then turned and walked out of the store as quietly as he had entered. A profound, stunned silence fell over the general store. Everyone looked from Noah's retreating back to Marcus's face, which had gone a blotchy, sweaty pale. He tried to laugh it off, to make a joke, but the sound was hollow and desperate. The spell was broken. The charm had vanished. He was no longer Marcus, the funny, loyal friend. He was now the man that quiet, gentle Noah Anderson, Richard's perfect son, had just calmly, publicly, and utterly condemned. The whispers had already begun before the bell on the door had finished chiming. The rot had set in. His social ruin was now just a matter of time. I was in the garden when Noah returned. He didn't say where he had been. He didn't have to. He came and stood beside me, and we looked at the roses together, their crimson petals a defiant splash of color against the coming winter. The judgment had been rendered. The sentence had been passed. My long, silent war was finally over. The judgment once passed could not be recalled. It settled over our house like a fine layer of ash, coating every surface, dulling every color. The silence that had been a weapon of oppression now became a tomb. Richard retreated to his bedroom and rarely came out. The king was deposed, his kingdom shrunk to a single room with a view of the dying autumn leaves. He was no longer the architect of my prison. He was just another inmate, trapped in a cell of his own making, haunted by the ghost of a son who was still very much alive. Noah and I moved through the quiet house, our orbits redrawn around a new center of gravity, the shared, terrible truth. We didn't speak of it. We didn't need to. It was in the way he would bring me a cup of tea without my asking, the way his hand would rest on my shoulder as he passed my chair. It was in the way we could sit together in the living room for an hour, reading in comfortable silence, the unspoken understanding between us a stronger bond than any words. The weight I had carried alone for 20 years was now shared, and in that sharing, it became bearable. Richard's decline was rapid. The cancer was eating away at his lungs, but it was Noah's rejection that was devouring his soul. He had built his entire life on the foundation of a lie, and that lie was his legacy. With the foundation shattered, the entire structure of his being came crashing down. The man who had commanded rooms with his easy confidence was now a frail, trembling creature who could barely meet my eyes when I brought him his meals on a tray. One afternoon, as I placed his tray on the bedside table, his hand, thin and papery as a dead leaf, shot out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Lily," he rasped, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading light. "Please. Talk to him. Make him understand." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back at his face. There was no anger left in me. There was no hatred. There was only a vast, empty expanse, a landscape scoured clean by decades of pain. "There is nothing left to understand, Richard," I said, my voice gentle. I gently uncurled his fingers from my wrist. "He knows everything." I left him there, staring at the wall, the portrait of him and a 5-year-old Noah on a fishing trip, a memory I now knew to be a carefully staged photograph, mocking him from his bedside table. The ripples of Noah's judgment spread through Maple Creek with the slow, inevitable certainty of a stain. No one knew the details of what had happened in the general store, only that Noah Anderson, a boy known for his quiet integrity, had publicly and coldly condemned his uncle. The town's imagination, left to fester in the absence of facts, did the rest. Marcus's social life withered on the vine. Men who had clapped him on the back for years now found reasons to cross the street when they saw him coming. His contracting business, built on handshakes and a reputation for being a good guy, began to falter as clients suddenly postponed projects indefinitely. He became a solitary figure, seen drinking alone at the town's only tavern, his booming laughter replaced by a sullen, resentful silence.
He was a man being slowly erased, not by an accusation, but by a quiet, unshakable judgment. One evening, as Noah and I were washing the dinner dishes, he fell silent. He stood staring out the window above the sink, into the dark garden.
"How?" he finally asked, his voice low. "How did you live with it for so long, Mom? How did you not go insane?" I stopped drying the plate in my hand and turned to him. I looked at his face, at his eyes, my eyes, which were filled with a pained, sorrowful understanding that no 20-year-old should ever have to possess. "In the beginning," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I didn't think I would. But then you were born." I reached out and touched his cheek. "And my only thought every single day was that I had to survive long enough to make sure you knew the truth. I wasn't waiting for him to die, Noah. I was waiting for you to be old enough to understand. I was waiting for you." Tears welled in his eyes and in mine. He pulled me into his arms, and we stood there in the quiet yellow light of the kitchen, holding each other, a mother and son finally free to grieve a lifetime of stolen moments. Richard died 2 months later, in the dead of winter, on a night when the snow was falling so heavily it seemed to be trying to bury the world in a shroud of white. There was no dramatic deathbed confession, no final plea for forgiveness. I found him in the morning. He had passed in his sleep. His face in death was not peaceful. It was slack with confusion, his last expression one of utter, pathetic defeat. The man whose ambition had been a raging inferno had gone out like a guttering candle. The funeral was a quiet, somber affair. The town came, just as they had come for so many other funerals. They filed past me and Noah, offering the same tired condolences. "He was a pillar of this community," one man said, shaking Noah's hand. "A great man," a woman whispered to me, dabbing her eyes. The words were meaningless, absurd. They were eulogizing a fictional character. Noah stood beside me, tall and straight, his face a mask of polite neutrality. He was not grieving a father. He was bearing witness to the final burial of a lie. That night, after the last of the casserole dishes had been cleared away, Noah and I sat in the living room. The house was quieter than it had ever been. The oppressive weight of Richard's presence, which had lingered for nearly 50 years, was finally gone. The legacy he had fought and killed and sacrificed for was shattered. It had not been dismantled in a courtroom or in the town square, but in the one place it truly mattered, in the heart of his son. The house was finally ours. The air was clean. We were free. The sun is warm on my back, a gentle, benevolent heat that sinks deep into my old bones. I sit here in my armchair, the same one I have sat in for years, but it feels different now. The fabric feels softer. The room feels brighter. The silence is no longer a presence, but an absence. The absence of fear, of unspoken tension, of a lie that took up all the air in the house for nearly half a century. The story I have held inside me for so long has finally been told, if only to the quiet, listening air of this room. And in the telling, its power over me has gone. After Richard's funeral, the house slowly began to breathe again. For weeks, I walked through the rooms as if discovering them for the first time. I reclaimed them, one by one. I took down the heavy, dark oil paintings he had favored and left the walls bare and clean. I filled the silence not with television or radio, but with the classical music he had always dismissed as noise. I rearranged the furniture, moving this very armchair to its rightful place by the window, where I could see my garden. This house is no longer a prison or a monument to a lie. It is simply my home. Noah is the anchor of this new, quiet life. He finished his degree, became a historian, a man dedicated to the careful, honest examination of the past. He lives 2 towns over with a family of his own now, but he visits me every weekend. He is a good man. A good father. His children, my grandchildren, fill this old house with laughter, a sound so pure and joyful it feels like a cleansing. They know nothing of the darkness that once lived here.
They know only the love of their grandmother and the gentle strength of their father. That is the only inheritance that matters. Today, he is here with me, working in the garden. I watch him from my window. He has my eyes, but he has his own soul, one that he forged himself from the hard-won truth. He is kneeling by the rose bushes, his hands, strong and gentle, carefully pruning away the deadwood. He learned my love for gardening, for the patient, honest work of cultivation. He sees me watching and smiles, a genuine, easy smile that lights up his whole face. He waves and I wave back, my heart full of a quiet, profound peace that I once believed was impossible. He is my legacy, not Richard's name, not Marcus's blood, but my love, my endurance, my truth, all made manifest in the form of a good man tending a garden. My revenge was never about fire and fury. I realized that long ago in the sterile white of that hospital room, holding my newborn son. I didn't need to see them in chains or ruined in a court of law. That would have been their kind of justice, a loud, public spectacle. Mine was quieter, and I think more complete. I just needed my son to know the truth. I needed him to be free of the poison of their pact. I needed him to know in the deepest core of his being that he came from love. My love. A love so fierce it survived in the most toxic soil imaginable, and not from a monstrous bargain struck between two weak and desperate men. Richard wanted a legacy of his name, a monument to his own importance. He built it with lies and cruelty, and it crumbled into dust the moment the truth was spoken. Marcus wanted a life of easy charm, of respectability he hadn't earned. His name is now a half-forgotten whisper in this town, a cautionary tale with no specifics. Their world was a house of cards, and a single breath of truth blew it all away. But the truth, my truth, survived. It grew slowly, quietly right here in this garden. I watered it with my tears in the dead of night. I nurtured it with a mother's silent, stubborn vow. I protected it from the frost of despair and the heat of my own anger. And it has blossomed into this peace, this freedom, this good man, my son, standing in the afternoon sun. I get up from my chair, my joints protesting slightly, and walk to the cherrywood table. The silver frame is cool in my hands. For years, it has sat here, turned slightly away, a quiet act of dismissal. But that is no longer enough. The story is over. Its power is gone. With a calm, final deliberation, I turn the photograph completely around, so its silver back is all that shows, a blank slate, an erased memory. I return to my chair and look out the window. Noah has finished his pruning. He stands and stretches, looking with satisfaction at his work. He looks at the roses, at the hydrangeas, at the world he and I have cultivated together. And I, sitting here in my sunlit room, am finally, completely, and blessedly free.